Good to see everyone out again this Sunday evening to study God's Word, to look into His Word and see what we can learn. Before we get into the lesson, I was listening to the conversation before services, which are always interesting. And we were talking about footwear and shoes and things like that. That's a really important part of our life that we sometimes overlook. You know, you got to take care of your feet. You got to make sure that you do what you need to be healthy, and that's often an indication how well you do that of how your health in general. So the reason I bring this up is because this is for men out there. I don't know if this is so much for women, because men's and women's bodies are shaped differently, and man has the support up here on top. But for me, I used to wear dress shoes that had the heel on it. The men's dress shoes, not like a woman's heel, but you know what I'm talking about. It's got the thick heel on the back. And those shoes, they can be hard on a man's alignment, on his back and his legs and everything. And I used to wonder why I was so uncomfortable. And so I buy some special shoes. Well, not necessarily special, but you can get them at a website called Vivo Barefoot. And they have these dress shoes. They look like dress shoes, but they have a flat sole. So a man's foot it has an arc in it. And so if you try to strengthen a steady arc, it weakens that arc. So that's what happens when you put those dress shoes on with the heel. And I've seen some men with these very expensive shoes, and I don't know how they're doing it. I mean, it must hurt. But if you want to check that out, it's called Vivo Barefoot, and you know, they have not only dress shoes, they have work shoes, they have running shoes, walking shoes. So that's just, you know, that's all for free tonight. You can take that home. And I just thought I'd say that's the best decision, one of the best decisions I've made in my life. I started wearing these probably about 4 years ago, and it's really helped me. So if you want to check that out. If it were up to me, I'd be barefoot 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I just, you know, that's the way I am. So, but anyways, we've been studying in the book of Numbers, and we've been looking through here and seeing how, learning these lessons from the Israelites and seeing how God's been holding their hand, and He's brought them out from Egypt, and He's trying to help them understand to learn to put their trust in Him instead of focusing on inconveniences and things like that, and letting that rule the day. So we've seen how in chapters 15 through 19, this is really, and this is quite interesting, the fact that chapters 15 through 19 is really about all we have of this 40-year period, the detail part. I mean, it's mentioned in the Bible and other places, but as far as the details, that's about all we have. Because beginning in chapter 20, you'll see there in verse 1, it talks about the first month. Now we know that that's not the first month from when they came out from Egypt. I've been showing you guys the timetable, how they came out from Egypt in Exodus. They were at the Mount for a month in Leviticus, and then we kind of looked at the timetable from the beginning of the Numbers, and we were looking at like a couple of years there. So now all of a sudden we see that the first month is mentioned here in this verse. That's talking about the first month after that 40-year period. So from here on out, there's not going to be much time. Although there's still 16 chapters left, there's not going to be a lot of time as far as this and the time they get into the land of Canaan. We still have the book of Deuteronomy too, but you'll see that this is it. And chapter 20 is it's a sad chapter. It actually has two deaths within it. It has the death of Miriam, it has the death of Aaron at the end, and it also has the announcement that Moses, the man, has put all this work in and has worked all this time to get them in the land of Canaan. It's announced that he's not going to be able to see it. And as I said before, leadership, no matter what you're doing, church, work, sports, whatever it is, if you're in a position of leadership, you're going to be tested. It's going to come with stress, and there's going to be disappointments at times. And Moses had to learn the lesson here that he was not going to be able to see the land of Canaan. And we're going to get into that a little bit later as we move on through this chapter. We did, if I remember last time, we did touch on Moses' sin. I didn't really get a chance to, as a matter of fact, I remember giving you guys a little bit of homework. Not really, but I asked you guys to kind of think about and chew on that. So does anybody have an idea of what Moses' sin was? Can you pinpoint really what it was?
Basically, he disobeyed God, didn't he?
He did disobey God. He did. We're going to see he did something here that was let me just say this. The reason I asked that question is because most people will say, well, he smote the rock instead of speaking to it. And that is part of it because God told him to go and speak to the rock. But we're going to see here that it goes a little deeper than that. And I'm going to show you that the real sin that he did, that where he took the staff and hit the rock, that was part of it, but it was really an outgrowth of an attitude that he had on the inside, and it was part of it. That was part of it, but I'm going to show you the crux of the whole matter here. Let me just read through some verses here, and then we'll go back and unpack it. Verse 1 says, Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, into the desert of Zin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. And by the way, that's about all we have on Miriam's death. That we have that statement there. Verse 2, And there was no water for the congregation. And they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people chode with Moses and spake, saying, Would God we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. And why have you brought up the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our cattle should die there? And wherefore have you made us to come up out of Egypt, to bring us unto this evil place? It is no place of seed, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, neither is there any water to drink. I want to stop right there, and we touched on this last time, but think about these people saying, you brought us up to this evil place. That shows the discontentment and the bad attitude of these people. God, you see, they're failing to recognize what God brought them out of. And I can imagine the slavery, and I don't mean to bring up bad times in this country, but the slavery in this country, for example, I'm sure that when that was all occurring and when people came to help these people out of slavery, that at first they didn't know any better. They didn't know anything else. That was what they knew. And so the people that were trying to help them, they probably were biting the hand that was feeding them. You get what I'm saying? They were probably thinking, you're trying to take away my livelihood. This is all I know. But really, they were trying to free the people up from this practice that doesn't need to be going on. And this is kind of like what's happening with the Israelites. God is trying to redeem them from this way of life in Egypt, which was a life of bondage and hard toil and work and all that, and be in slavery. And they're failing to understand how grateful they should be for that. They get out here in the wilderness, and they have God in their presence. They have the cloud by day leading them, which is a signal of God's presence. They have God's presence in the tabernacle. They have the blessings of the manna. They have blessings of God performing miracles and all these different things. And they have God's promise that they'll go into the land of Canaan. But they couldn't. They were not patient enough to wait and endure, because God didn't do it right away. He made the promise to Abraham, and He made the promise to the nation, but He just didn't do it right away. And they weren't really that far from Egypt when they got out in the wilderness from there to the land of Canaan. And so you might be thinking, well, why didn't God just take them and pick them up and set them in the land? Well, the answer to that question is in the book of Deuteronomy, where He says, I did that to prove you and to test you, to see whether or not you were serving me for the right reason. I wanted to know, are these people just serving me because they can get this stuff out of me? And obviously they were, some of them. But you see, it's like the Christian walk. And I said this last week, if I could go out and preach the gospel today and say, if you obey the gospel, all your problems, you're exempt from all problems. Do you know I could baptize people by the hundreds? I mean, we could fill this room, we could fill this building up, and congregations throughout the world could fill the buildings with people to obey the gospel. But what's the problem with that? The problem with that is if you bring all those people in based on that condition, you would have the church full of hypocrites. They would only be there for that one reason, to get away from their problems. Not because they love God, not because they love the things of God, not because they love and appreciate God's mercy and grace through the cross. It'd be just because, well, I get a free ticket in life. And the church already has hypocrites in it, but I digress. But the thing about it is, if that was the way it was, then the church would just be full like that. So God's trying to get them to see, you need to just trust in me and let me run the show, as it were. Now, that doesn't mean that they had to do nothing, but you just obey what I say, and based on those conditions, I'm going to get you into the land of Canaan. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about what I promised. I've made the promise. I'll stick to it. Look at Abraham. look at all these, the examples they had from that time till now. They could look and see that God promised Abraham a son. And even Abraham had problems with that, but he finally had that son, didn't he? He had Isaac, on up in age, and different things that he promised Abraham. So, and the reason they're sitting here saying this, calling it this evil place, is because they're failing to appreciate spiritual things, and they're fixating on problems. And that's what we do in life when we start losing our sight on Jesus, and we start focusing on problems, and we stop appreciating spiritual things. We start getting unthankful. We start getting an attitude that we're grumpy, we're complaining, and God doesn't like that. God, He does not appreciate His children doing that after all that He's done. So we see there that they're calling it the evil place there, and they're just failing to realize how good that they have it. So then we read, let's see here, verse 6. And Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they fell upon their faces. How many times have we seen this? How many times have they messed up? They keep backbiting against God. They keep backbiting against Moses. And Moses, they have to go fall down upon their knees before the tabernacle to pray. And that shows that Moses, he's a good man. He really is genuine and wants what's best. Because he could say, that's what you get. It's good enough for you. God's about to, unleash it on you. But they didn't do that. And the glory of the Lord appeared unto them. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, now here we're going to get into Moses' sin. I'm going to read through this, and then we're going to see, go back and look what the problem was. It says, the Lord spake to Moses, saying, take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron and thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. Thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts to drink. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. Now, apparently the rod was kept up in the tabernacle at this time, the rod that he used for the miracles in Egypt and this parting the Red Sea. Verse 10, and Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before the Lord, or before the rock, and he said unto them, hear ye now, you rebels, must we fetch water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand with his rod, and he smote the rock twice, and water came out abundantly. And the congregation drank, and their beasts also. So we see here that Moses, his patience is being really tested here. And as we look at this sin of Moses, I want to go back and look at some verses in Exodus chapter 32. And I want you to notice something. In Exodus chapter 32, and to bring you up to speed, this is where Moses went up to the mountain. And if you've ever seen the movie The Ten Commandments, you might know more what I'm talking about. It's in the Bible too. But it's when he goes up into the mountain and the people build the golden calf. He comes down, he's mad. That movie really shows that, brings that forward. But he comes back down, and they're involved in this sin. They built this calf, and he's angry. And God is angry. And so Moses has to take the tent outside the camp, because he had not been involved in the sin, and he's trying to figure out what is going to happen now. This people, they're involved in sin, and so God, He can't dwell where sin is. So how is God going to handle this? You see, the plan of redemption was not fully revealed to them back then. He didn't understand how is God going to deal with this. And let's see here. I was looking for the verse. Let's see. I'll just have to skip that, but I can still make the point here. Look what it says in verse 10. And this is the Lord speaking to Moses, and after the sin that they had been guilty of. It says, now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. So basically what's going on is they had been guilty of the sin. Moses goes down. He sees what's happening, and God says to him, you just get out of the way, and I'll just consume this whole nation and make another nation from you. But we know what happens. Moses, he doesn't want that. He goes to God and prays for them, and God spares the nation because of that. But my point here, the whole point I want you to see here is God was so angry with this sin that he said, I'll just wipe this nation out and I'll make another one from you, Moses. And he could have done it. Moses was in the line of Abraham, wasn't he? He had the notches in his belt. So he could have done that. So just remember that. Now look over in Numbers chapter 14. In Numbers chapter 14, in 13 and 14, we remember this is where they sent the spies over. And they went over there and they saw the land. Yeah, that's good. They come back and discouraged the whole congregation. And God was not pleased with what they were doing because they were fixing to stone Joshua and Caleb and Moses and Aaron. And God came down in the midst of it. Now look what God says in the beginning in verse 11. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me for all the signs which I have shown among them? I will smite them with the pestilence and disinherit them and make thee a greater nation and mightier than they. So again, like in Exodus 32, he says, this sin is serious. I'll wipe them out and make a whole other nation from you. Moses again goes to the Lord, prays for them, they're spared again. Now, incidentally, even after that, that generation would eventually die off in the wilderness because of their sin. But he didn't do it right away. He didn't do what he was wanting to do. Moses, through his prayers, spared them. Now look in Numbers chapter 16, very familiar that we've just studied, where he was dealing with Korah and that whole rebellion about the priesthood. He says, and this is God's attitude toward that, in beginning in verse 20, the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. So this is the third time that we see Exodus 32, Numbers 14, and Numbers 16. God said, this is a sin that's so serious, I'm ready to wipe this whole nation out and create another one. But every time God spared them because of Moses' prayer, which shows the power of prayer, by the way. But my whole point of showing you that is just remember that God, in these particular sins, there was something about these sins that God says, this is serious, and I'm going to just wipe out the whole nation. Now, as we look at the sin of Moses in chapter 20, what is it that you see absent from that whole account there?
Moses didn't say spare.
Well, God didn't say, I want to destroy him. So as bad as it was for them to complain about the water, he never said anything about like he did in these three accounts here. God, you got to remember, this is a second generation. This is not that first generation who already knew, they knew better, and they had already complained about water in one account. If you remember back in Exodus 17, matter of fact, let me just go read that while we're on this. This is the second time, this is actually the second time that they complained about water. But this is the second generation. Exodus 17, they were just out of Egypt. And listen to what happens here in Exodus 17. It says, all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of sin. That's kind of a coincidence, the wilderness of sin. After their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord, and they pitched in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, why chide ye with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, go on before the people, take with thee the elders of Israel, and take thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, take in thine hand and go, and so on. Verse 6, behold, I'll stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. So, what's absent from here? This is the first time that they complained about the water. We don't see where God said, I want to just destroy, wipe out the nation, and make a new nation. So there's something about the fact that this sin, although it's sinful where they're complaining about the water, it's very early on. You see, God wants man to understand that you don't have to go around walking on eggshells. He's not a big, scary, God in the sky ready to pounce on us around every corner. And that's what he wants people to understand. And so this time where they complain about the water here in Exodus, they're just newly out of Egypt. This is a new experience, and God is long-suffering and merciful with people. He's patient. And so, he's not going to, the times that he said, I want to wipe them out and make a new nation, this is times where it's either a serious sin or something where they've already been through enough, they should know better by now. And so apparently this complaining about the water, God was not looking on it so harshly as these other sins. So, I said all that to say this. Back in Numbers 20, we see here that the real problem of what Moses did, he failed to represent the character of God in the right way. You see, Moses took it upon himself, and he was, they were tempting, they were really pushing Moses' buttons. But he had no right to deal with that the way he did. God simply said, you go and speak to the rock. This is the second generation. Although they may have been there whenever their parents complained back in Exodus 17, they were children. They didn't know any better. And this generation here, this is one of their first mistakes along these lines. So I'm going to be patient with them. I'm not going to come down. And Moses should have been thinking, you know what? God didn't. He's not treating this like the golden calf. He's not treating this like the time that we sent the spies over. But he failed to do that. And because of his haste, he got impatient and he got angry and he represented God in a tyrannical way. That was his sin. And verse 10, let me let's see here. There's a verse I want you guys to see. Let's see. I'll find it in just a second. There it is. Look at Psalm 106. Psalm 106 gives you a divine commentary on what the sin of Moses was. Psalm 106 is where the psalmist is here. He's explaining and kind of giving a history of Israel, and he's alluding back to certain events that happened, and he alludes back to this very event here. And I'll just begin in verse 28 to give us a little context here. He says, they joined themselves also, he's speaking of Israel, they joined themselves also to Baal Peor and ate the sacrifices of the dead. They provoked him to anger with their inventions, and the plague brake in upon them. Then stood up Phinehas and executed judgment, and so the plague was stayed. And that was counted unto him for righteousness unto all generations forevermore. Now look at verse 32. They angered him also at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses for their sakes, because they provoked his spirit so that he spake unadvisedly with his lips. So that was the sin of Moses. He failed to represent the character of God. He spake unadvisedly with his lips. And you ask, what was that? That's that's pointing an arrow directly to verse 10 of Numbers 20. And where it says, and Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before them, before the rock, and he said unto them, hear now, you rebels, must we fetch water out of this rock? Now that's exactly the sin that Psalm 106 is referring to. You see, Moses, he should have been doing exactly what God said. Moses said, all I need you to do right now, Moses, is go down and speak to the rock and bring forth water. But you see, Moses is thinking back to that first generation where God told him to smite the rock, which is not a sinful thing. It's not inherent to hit a rock with a stick, is it? There's nothing inherently sinful about that, but God didn't tell him to do that. That's what he said to do the first time. This is a whole new generation. They're going to have their own set of problems. They need to be shown grace and mercy just like that first one. They don't need to pay for the sins in that sense of their fathers that they had done and they were not guilty of. So we see there that's the problem with Moses here. He failed to give God the glory. He failed to represent God the correct way. And we see, beginning in verse 12, it says, the Lord spake to Moses and Aaron, because you believed me not. See, this is serious. He says, you believe me not. He said, because you did this is an act of unfaithfulness on your part. You're like an unbeliever in this, Moses. Because you believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. This is the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel strove with the Lord, and he was sanctified in them. So God said, you didn't sanctify me in the eyes of the people, but I'll make sure that I'll be sanctified. So he gives the consequences to Moses of not entering the land of Canaan. So we see there the sin of Moses, yes, it involved hitting the rock, but it came from a deeper, that was a symptom of a deeper malady, if you will. That was an attitude where Moses was pushed to the limit, and in the spur of the moment, in the heat of the moment, he acted ill-advisedly, he spake unadvisedly with his lips. So just remember there that Moses, he's not perfect, he has his flaws, and I'm glad that we have people like this in the Bible with you know, it helps me to understand that I'm not going to heaven based on my work anyways. The things that I do within myself, my life is tainted with mistakes, and I have flaws and frailties and weaknesses. But in spite of that, God will show me mercy and grace. Because even with Moses not getting to see the land and go in, who was it that appeared with Jesus in the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew 17? Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And so we see there that even though Moses didn't get to see the land of Canaan, and that shows that God had something in view more than the land of Canaan. It wasn't just all, as cool as it is to read about them getting the land and going in and taking these nations, that wasn't the end. God had something further, was looking at something better than that, and that was heaven. So that pretty much wraps up the sin of Moses. Are there any questions or comments before we move on? All right. So now we move on to verses 14. Let's see here. Get to the right place in my notes. (14 to 21). And this is where they run into the nation of Edom. Verse 14, it says, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh unto the king of Edom. Thus saith thy brother Israel, Thou knowest all the travail that hath befallen us, how our fathers went down into Egypt, and we have dwelt in Egypt for a long time, and the Egyptians vexed us and our fathers. And when we cried unto the Lord, he heard our voice, and sent an angel, and hath brought us forth out of Egypt, and behold, we are in Kadesh, a city in the uttermost of thy border. Let us pass, I pray thee, through thy country. We will not pass through the fields, or through the vineyards, neither will we drink of the water of the king's highway. We will not turn to the right hand nor to the left, until we have passed thy borders. And Edom said unto him, Thou shalt not pass by me, lest I come out against thee with the sword. And the children of Israel said unto him, We will go by the highway, and if I and my cattle drink of thy water, then I'll pay for it. I will only without doing anything else go through on my feet. And he said, Thou shalt not go through. And Edom came out against him with much people and a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his border, wherefore Israel turned away from him. So, does anybody know who Edom is, the nation of Edom? They're basically the descendants of Esau. So if you remember all the way back in Genesis, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. And we know that Jacob, as time went on, his name was changed to, it was changed to Israel. So Jacob would be the forefront he would be a foreshadowing of the nation of Israel. His name was changed to Israel. And Esau was Jacob's brother. And if you know the history, we see where due to Rebekah and her encouragement to Jacob, to Jacob, Isaac was going to bless Esau because he was the firstborn. And what happened was she had Jacob go in and disguise himself and act like he was Esau. Isaac was on up in age, he couldn't see very well, and he basically stole the blessing from Esau, his brother. But Esau didn't care about the blessing anyways. And whenever it was taken away from him, Hebrews said he cried with bitter tears. But there was nothing he could do at that point. He had already despised the birthright. He didn't care about spiritual things. He didn't care about the things of God. And so Jacob ended up getting the birthright. Although it was wrong for Jacob to do what he did. But we see there that he goes in and gets the birthright. And so there's this enmity between Jacob and Esau. Jacob had to flee for his life. Esau finds out what happened. And he said, I'm going to kill Jacob. So he ends up going and spending time with a man named Laban, who was Rebekah's kinfolks, if you will. That was her relatives. And so while he's over there for 14 years, letting Esau cool down, 14 years he's gone. He's estranged from his family. He runs for his life. And so he's over there, and he finally talks Laban into marrying his daughter, and Laban lies to him. He gets one daughter, and it's just a big mess down there. And all this because of the deception and trying to manipulate God's promise in his life. There's a lot of lessons you can learn from Jacob. But so whenever he gets ready to come back home, you'll see that when he comes back, he's scared of Esau. He's afraid that Esau's going to kill him. He's still afraid that he's still angry. And so he gets back close to home. He sends a company. He divides himself, his whole crew, into two groups there. And he sends that one before. He said, if they kill that one, at least I'll have one part of the family survive. And so that family goes forth and meets Esau and comes back to Jacob and said, everything's fine. He's cooled down. Everything's, So Esau and everything and Jacob, they had this enmity, but Esau finally forgot about it because he didn't care about the spiritual things anyways. But that's the history of Jacob and Esau. And so that's why it says in verse 14, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, thus saith thy brother Israel. And so basically what's happening is Israel's out in the wilderness. They're trying to explain to these descendants of Abraham here, physical descendants of Abraham, this is from Esau, they're trying to say, look, you need to show some compassion here to your brother. We're out here in the wilderness. God has redeemed us from Egypt. And if you do that, we're your friends. We're not here to be your enemy. And what happens is the Edomites, they had this attitude, and I guess it may have stemmed back from the conflict of Jacob and Esau, that they just weren't going to have that. They were not going to sit there and tolerate Israel passing through their land. And that's pretty prideful and arrogant. And we see here that causes a problem, and so Israel turns away. But, this all stems back from Jacob and Esau. And if you go and read the book of, I'm not going to turn there, but if you read the book of Obadiah, you'll see the attitude of the Edomites. And God finally brought judgment on the Edomites for this sin. He didn't do it right here, but he finally brought judgment on them because they kept more and more pushing that arrogance and that pride and thinking that they were so much better, and that they kept hanging on to that grudge back there, and God just brought judgment on them. And so when you read in Romans chapter, I'll say all that to say this, when you read in Romans chapter 9:13 that Paul said concerning God that Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated, you can understand now it was not just some arbitrary thing where God said, well, Jacob, I'll just pick him out and leave Esau out and just be unfair and he won't have a chance and I'll show favoritism to Jacob. It had nothing to do with that. It all had to do with the fact that God hates sin wherever it's found. And when he picks a channel for the promise to come through, that's based on his preference. It has nothing to do with favoritism. So the promise would come through the line of Jacob, even though Esau was the firstborn. So we see there that they had a problem here with the Edomites, but they turned away. And really this all goes back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where God said to Abraham, I'll bless them that bless thee, but I'll curse them that curse thee. And basically what that boils down to, those who Israel came into contact with, surrounding nations, if they would be accepting of Israel and bless them, it was like that was their attitude towards Israel's God. But if they cursed Israel, if they were, like the Edomites here, and were arrogant and prideful and rejecting the Israelites, that's the same as saying we're rejecting their God. And it's like they're arguing for their idols. And that's the way that God saw it. So don't think that God was arbitrary when he brings judgment on these nations. He gave them a chance here. This was the Edomites' chance to say, you know what, maybe we should just overlook all that and smooth everything out. They're trying to offer us the blessing here. And they could have had the spiritual blessing through that. We're running out of time here. Verse 22, it says, the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh, came to Mount Hor. And the Lord spake to Moses and to Aaron in Mount Hor by the coast of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given unto the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up to the Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them upon Eleazar his son. And Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, and shall die there. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and they went up into the mount, to Mount Hor, in the sight of all the congregation. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, put them on Eleazar his son, And Aaron died there in the top of the mount, and Moses and Eleazar came down from the mount. When all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, they mourned for Aaron 30 days, even all the house of Israel. If I was wanting you to take something away from this chapter, of course the sin of Moses is a pretty big deal, but just remember this. 3 people who were very important back here, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, not one of them people entered into the land of Canaan. And that shows you that God, the faith of the Bible is not based upon blood and flesh. These were 3 great people in the line of Abraham here, but not one of them entered the land of Canaan. God is interested with the inside. He's interested with the faith of Abraham. And even though they didn't get to enter in, they still were able to enjoy God's blessings, and they'll be in heaven. They're in heaven. They'll be in heaven one day. And so we see there that as great as they were, they had flaws, they had mistakes, and they did not enter into the land of Canaan. I appreciate your attention tonight. We'll stop there and begin in chapter 21 next time. So at this point, we'll go ahead and move into our invitation portion for tonight. And I want to look at a verse that I actually used in my sermon this morning. And it comes from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. And of course, Jesus is trying to help people understand that you can't serve God, you can't have your loyalties divided. And we went over that this morning. But the verse is Matthew 6:24. He says, "No man can serve 2 masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." And he makes the point there that it's not that you can't go out here and work and make a living and get material things that you need. He's making the point that you can't let that be your number one priority. Don't let the pressures of life make you fearful and drive you from fear into thinking that that's all that life is bound up in. And Revelation talks about the people that are not going to be in heaven as people that are fearful and unbelieving. That's the kind of fear he's talking about, that fear of the world, that anxiety, that unrest in the world, that everything is bound up in just material things and what we're going to do on this earth. And so he makes the point here that you need to have your priorities straight. Now, in Romans chapter 6, Paul elaborates upon this point. Listen to what he says in Romans chapter 6. And of course, he mentions baptism in verses 3 and 4, the fact that we are buried with Christ in baptism, and our old man is crucified, that old life is in the past. Look what he says beginning in verse 16. "Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom you obey, whether sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness." And that's exactly what Jesus said. He said, you can't serve both. And you are going to serve one. People sometimes think, well, I won't worship anything. I won't be in submission to anything. But you're going to be in submission to something. You're either going to worship God or you're either going to worship the world and the way of the world. Verse 17 says, "But God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin," remember John 8:32, "You shall know the truth shall make you free. Being made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness." So would you rather be a servant in submission to righteousness and God and truth, or would you rather be a slave and be shackled by sin? And be a slave to the way of the world, a slave to money, a slave to material things that just build anxiety in the life. We see here that the Bible makes it clear that you want to go down the path of serving God and doing what He says, which is going to be a much better way, much better way of living. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian and you'd like to serve God and serve righteousness and live your life that way, you can do that by obeying the gospel plan of salvation by repentance, confession, and baptism. If you're a member of the church and you strayed from God's grace, you can be brought back into the fold by repentance, confession, and prayer. Whatever your need may be, we're here for you. We're here to help you. We want to pray for you. Please come as together we stand and sing.